Hey guys, we're going to wrap up this section of the unit real quickly. So the thing you need in front of you is that Wilson 14 points note-taking sheet. This is a longer section, so I'm going to probably suggest that you pause and take notes off the screen if you feel like I'm going too fast for you, because I want to get this all done in one video. All right, so just some background on Wilson. Just so we kind of understand who this guy was. First of all, he not dumb, bachelor's degree from Princeton, a law degree from the University of Virginia, and then a PhD from Johns Hopkins. So in terms of his intellectual ability, he's brilliant. Not that many of our presidents were really dumb, but think about Roosevelt. That guy wrote books. He was well read. He kind of had this incredible academic background, and Wilson kind of has that as well. What makes Wilson's rise even more interesting is the fact that he had more or less been an intellectual, worked as a college professor and president of Princeton. He didn't really start running for political office until 1910. He becomes president in 1912. Now, the one thing I do kind of want you to take notes of here is this stuff on his views down here, right? So if we start looking at this stuff, he begins we begin to notice that first of all, it's called the New Freedom, just as a comparison to the Square Deal or the New Deal a little bit later, New Freedom. Um, he's kind of continuing most of the ideas of the progressive movement, right? Pro trust busting, anti-tariff, which will make more sense later. He believed that increasing competition among companies would benefit the people at large. Now, things that he opposed, welfare programs. He didn't believe in welfare programs, and we've already kind of talked about this before. He's not well regarded for his views on civil rights. He was a well-known white supremacist and actually took active steps to kind of limit the government from hiring blacks. So obviously, he deserves some lower grades for those attitudes and those viewpoints. All right. So in terms of what we want to know here, again, there's a lot to kind of focus here, but let me try to simplify it, and maybe we just get what I'm saying and not what's on the screen. So the election of 1912, the thing I want you to notice is we start looking over here at this chart, you'll notice that Woodrow Wilson doesn't actually win a majority. He wins 41, basically 42% of the electorate, or the vote. He wins the Electoral College very easily. Now, how does someone who only gets 42% of the vote become president? It's because if we look here, we got Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. Teddy Roosevelt, who had basically served 2 terms, his first term he started in a little bit later because McKinley was killed. He took over as VP, and then he won easy re-election in 1904. But then decided to step aside and let William Taft, basically he handpicked this guy to be the next president. Now Taft was a more conservative Republican, not as interested in the progressive movement. And so what happens is Roosevelt's sitting at home and saying, "Yeah, I love the trust busting, but what about everything else?" And so then he begins to kind of uh, challenge him, and then eventually comes out and will try to steal the Republican nomination from him. The Republican establishment blocks him, defeats him. He doesn't get it. And so what Teddy Roosevelt will do is he'll run as the Progressive Party or the Bull Moose Party. And that's how Wilson became president. Because if you were to take the two sides of Roosevelt and Taft and combine them together, just look at the popular votes. They would have beaten Wilson pretty comfortably. They would have Electoral College would have swung to them, and Taft would have been president, or Roosevelt would have been president. But because of this weird anomaly, he's able to sneak in. So election of 1912 is another one of those weird ones, right? Next one. All right. So the big thing we want to know about Wilson is the 14 points. I'm just going to summarize this again, jot down the big ideas, don't write everything down. All right, so the U.S. joined the fight in World War I in the summer of 1918. Armistice is declared, which is not a peace treaty; it is merely stop shooting each other in November. The simplest way I can put it is that everyone was tired of fighting. The U.S. brought in fresh soldiers who were willing to fight. Germany tried to make one last effort to try to win the war. They came so close, but then got beat. Um, Typo here. It should say thought Wilson's 14 points would be the guide to a treaty. So Wilson gives a speech to Congress in which he outlines his 14 points for peace. Germany hears the 14 points and assumes that this will be the way they're treated. So they are willing to stop fighting because they think, hey, guess what? We're going to be treated fairly. All right. He said that everyone, including Germany, must be treated fairly. And so when Germany hears that, they're like, cool. And the US even tried to push Germany towards this conclusion by dumping pamphlets and mailings into Germany to try to sway the German public. Now, here's the problem. Germany will agree the armistice will be put into place. That's not a peace treaty. So when they get into peace treaty negotiations and it's not going the way Germany wanted it to, it's not really easy for Germany to say, all right, let's go to war again. So Germany, I hate to say, got tricked or duped. All right, more on that later. All right, so you might want to pause here and write all this stuff down. I'll talk a little bit about them, but Woodrow Wilson is your classic like Miss America contestant. What does he want? What's his world? What's his wish for the world? He wants world peace. And he's got a plan for it. He figures if we can do these four things, which are all embedded in his 14 points, we'll have world peace. So first thing, he wants to spread democracy. All right, a couple things in here that are kind of shocking. All right, one, ethnic groups will get their own countries. Remember, if we talk about what started the war, the Serbians wanted to be free of the Austrian Hungarians. He's basically saying, hey, all those countries, all those ethnic groups that are trapped in Austria Hungary and other places, free. Get to be your own country. It's pretty crazy. Next thing, and this is the most shocking one to me, is that he wanted to readjust and redo the colonies in line with what the people of the colonies wanted. Now, the reason it shocks me a little bit is because, again, we're talking, if Wilson was a kind of a white supremacist and believed the inferiority of other races, it's a little shocking that he would have wanted to provide the opportunity to those groups. Now, on the flip side of it, he called his foreign policy moral diplomacy, so doing what's right. So it's a little confusing. All right, number two, open markets. Basically, his argument was if we have tariffs, if we limit trade between countries, we don't talk as much, we're more hostile towards each other. So the more we trade, the more we talk, the more dependent we become. And that would basically allow for peace because we need each other and we know each other better than we would normally. All right. Number three is probably the one that you want to highlight or star. It's his most famous one. Uh, I don't have it on the slide, but you're going to want to jot it down. He wants to create an international peacekeeping organization. What is that called? That's the League of Nations, not the United Nations. That's going to come later, but the League of Nations. And his argument was this. One of the things that got us pulled into stupid war was all these secret alliances and all these built up militaries. What if we have a place for people that's open to discuss and go over information, and that would prevent the need for secret alliances. Also, people could have smaller armies because there's a way of solving problems through conversation and dialogue, not fighting. And then the last one is he just felt like the U.S. had been inactive to a great extent. He wanted the U.S. to become more of a player in the world scene, with the president kind of being at the middle of that. It doesn't mean taking more land or doing anything like that, but just instead of, we got to stop hiding behind the oceans, which is what we have been doing. All right, now I'll simplify this as fast as I can. These are what we call the Big Four. These are the countries that are there to influence the peace process. Notice who's not listed here: Germany or Austria-Hungary, for that matter. They are not included in the negotiation process. Now, I say the Big Four, but really it's the Big Three. No offense to Italy over here, but they don't really get anything they want out of it. And the story goes that our dear friend Orlando down there didn't speak English. They didn't get him a translator, and he couldn't participate. I don't know how true that is, but I like it. All right, now here's what we want to know. What do the big three want? So we know what Wilson wants: world peace. All right, what does George in England want? George is basically saying, all right, the only thing he cares about, I want to keep my stuff, right? Here's Wilson talking about redoing colonies, and that is not George's bag. He's not willing to give up his colonies because he knows what England is. England is a sad, cold, rainy island. If they give up their colonies, their power and influence in the world suddenly would drop significantly. Not there for that. All right. Now, the thing we want to know is Clemenceau or Clemenceau. He's from France. Now, the thing we want to get out of this is that he wants to punish Germany. He feels that France took the worst beating because the war was fought a lot in France, and he wants to basically make sure Germany never does this again. He wants to take land from them. He wants to crush them economically. He wants to limit their military. So when we start looking at all this stuff, right? If we're trying to put these guys on a spectrum, we have France, who's the most extreme, punish, punish, punish. Got England in the middle, who's self-interested, but also realized that Germany could be a very powerful friend. Let's not destroy them. Let's hurt them, but not destroy them. And then we got us playing hacky sack, singing kumbaya, looking for world peace. Now, here's the thing: what actually happens? All right. Again, let's just kind of summarize this as quickly as possible. You probably know this stuff from world history anyway. One, Germany is completely blamed for the war. We could go into the details here about why that doesn't make any sense, but nonetheless, Germany's blamed. and they are crushed for it. You can start seeing what's done to them. They pay a huge sum of money. They lose all their colonies. They lost land in Europe, a good chunk of land. They weren't allowed to have a navy or an air force, and their army was reduced to 100,000. Keep in mind, when the war started, they had an army of nearly 2 million before the war started. So basically, they have no form of protection, and they got to pay for the war. Oh, and they took away their colonies and land from in the land in Europe, making it even harder for them to pay. Now, you don't need to know all of these countries, so let's just summarize this. So basically, here's the deal, right? All these countries you see here listed were essentially, at one point or another, part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire or the Ottoman Empire, which we don't need to get into, but they got involved in the war on the wrong side. So Wilson gets what he wants. He gets all these countries being made up of different ethnic groups. Cool. Seems like he's done pretty well for himself. And then the other thing that we want to make sure we have down is that there is a League of Nations created out of this. So if we start looking at the results of this peace treaty, from Wilson's perspective, he got two of the things he really thought were super important. He didn't get the colonies divided up. That was never going to happen. But he did get ethnic groups. He did get new countries. He got his League of Nations, but Germany did get punished. Now, here's the thing. Wilson's pretty happy. But he's got a problem. The way the Constitution is set up is that he now needs to come home, and he now needs to get the Senate to ratify the treaty before it becomes official, and that's the problem. So Wilson will come home. Congress opposes this treaty. What don't they like? The League of Nations. The very thing that he thought was most important, the League of Nations, that was going to be the crown jewel, the thing that was going to prevent war from ever happening again, is the thing they did not want. Congress, and America in general, wanted to return to isolationism, get away from the world again. All right. They advocated and pushed for that to be dropped. They would have signed the treaty if Wilson was willing to drop the League of Nations. All right. Wilson refuses because he knows that it is, in his mind, the tool that will create world peace in the long run. So what does he do in response? Well, only thing a president can do, he needs to get the American people on his side. So as you can see here, he travels 8,000 miles in 20 days. Keep in mind, air travel was just becoming a thing. So he was basically crisscrossing the country, giving speeches at every train station he could stop in. And sometimes it would be literally come out, there'd be a platform in the middle of town, he'd give a speech, get back on the train and go. Or if there wasn't time for that, he would walk out the back end of the caboose and give a speech from there. This was the closest thing to a media blitz that the president could do at the time. Unfortunately, the aftermath is pretty devastating. Wilson worked so hard between the war, the treaty negotiation, and then this, he will suffer a massive stroke. Um, in fact, he will basically more or less be incapacitated the rest of his presidency. Now, that is kept from the public. This is a time in history where the press wasn't as interested in pulling stuff like this out and making big stories. But more or less, his wife and close advisors ran the White House while he was kind of incapacitated. The sad thing is the Treaty of Versailles, which he wanted, never actually gets signed. We will create a separate peace treaty that does not include the League of Nations, which is not the Treaty of Versailles. How close did he wind up getting to getting what he wanted? Well, 7 votes, which, you need 2/3 majority. That's not bad. But essentially, Wilson's dream of this world peace, led with the League of Nations at the center of it, comes up shy. And again, you probably already know this, that we're going to be heading into eventually World War II. And the question becomes, if people had listened to Wilson, all of Wilson's plan would have worked. We'll just never know. But we do know what happens when we didn't, which is to say we had a huge, massive, ugly global war. All right. See you guys later.